We continue with the conversation and you get more of Adrienne Lawrence. And this time I am bringing you democracy correspondent and national reporter who covers voting rights in the United States. That is Sam Levine. Thank you so much for joining us, Sam.
Hey, Adrienne, happy to be here.
Yeah, so I know Georgia has just seen its first major test for the GOP defending democracy. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, early voting just started last week in Georgia for the Republican primary. And one of those races is what I think is the most important race in America happening this year for democracy. It's the Republican primary for Secretary of State. Brad Raffensperger, who's the incumbent Republican, famously stood up to President Trump in 2020, refusing his request to overturn the election. And President Trump has been furious ever since then and has endorsed a candidate, Congressman Jody Hice, in an effort to oust Raffensperger from office. Congressman Hice has said the election was stolen. He joined efforts to overturn the election. He told me in Atlanta last week he saw no problem with Trump's call to Secretary Raffensperger asking him to find votes for him. So it's a very explicit effort to replace someone who refused to overturn an election with someone who would be more willing to do that.
So, well, what I'm hearing, Sam, is that Brad messed around and essentially made the mistake of telling the truth and standing up for democracy. And so now, as a result of that, there's a potential that he may not be able to keep his position as Secretary of State. How likely is it that he may not stay in his position?
Well, this race is really, really close. All the polling shows that most voters are undecided, and it's very, very close. I would say it's a toss-up. I talked to voters who were supporting Secretary Raffensperger. I talked to voters who were supporting Congressman Hice. But there's a couple more weeks of early voting, and we'll find out. But it's a really, really close race, and I would bet that it goes to a runoff election.
Interesting. And we know recently that the Georgia State Board of Elections had to prosecute, quasi-defend the case against Marjorie Taylor Green in terms of whether she could remain on the ballot because of her involvement with the January 6th insurrection. And ultimately, the administrative law judge determined that she can stay on the ballot. And thus, I guess we can infer that it was determined that she did not participate in the January 6th insurrection, or there was not sufficient evidence of such. But as a result of that, I know Raffensperger's office had to be involved in it. Is this in part what might be hurting him?
Well, I think the final determination is ultimately up to Secretary Raffensperger. I think the administrative law judge gave him a huge way out. It kind of threw him a bone by ruling that she should be eligible. So all Raffensperger's office would have to do now is accept the judge's finding. And it would be difficult to imagine a world in which he would vote to keep her off the ballot, especially given all the pressure that he's facing from the right in his party. So I would expect him to agree with the administrative law judge and allow her on the ballot.
Okay, and I also know that well, there's still that prosecution going on there when it comes to Trump and the call he made to Raffensperger. So I guess when these voters are coming to the polls, are they considering that? How is this playing into the mix?
Yeah, I didn't talk to any voters who seemed aware or particularly concerned that there was an ongoing criminal inquiry. This is in Fulton County. The district attorney there has convened a special grand jury to investigate whether Trump's call to Secretary Raffensperger broke the law. And that's still in kind of early stages. I think we'll find out more in the coming months. And the DA there has said that they're not going to make any announcements ahead of the election at the end of May. So I think we'll learn more after the election, but I think it's unlikely to play a major role in the primary.
And I know Trump is not necessarily one for people who have stood up to him or spoken out against him. And he likes to use his megaphone to tear people down who have done that. Has he used that against Raffensperger?
Absolutely. Trump has fumed against Secretary Raffensperger almost constantly since 2020. He's called him a rhino, and very aggressively campaigned against him, called for him to be voted out of office. Secretary Raffensperger told me late last year that they haven't spoken since 2020, and he doesn't really expect to speak to the president again. But President Trump has made it very clear that this is one of the major scalps that he'd like to get as sort of revenge for efforts to stand up to him after the 2020 election. The other major figure in Georgia, of course, is Governor Brian Kemp, who seems to be poised to beat the challenger that President Trump has endorsed, David Perdue, and pretty easily. So it seems unlikely that Trump is going to get a win in the governor's race, but it seems more unclear when it comes to this very important Secretary of State race.
I guess let me ask you, for those of us who don't remember, why did Trump endorse Perdue as opposed to Kemp?
Well, after the 2020 election, Trump and his allies put a lot of pressure on Governor Kemp to convene a special session of the Georgia legislature to try and appoint electors to the Electoral College in favor of President Trump. Governor Kemp, who's a very, very conservative governor, refused to do that. He said, my hands are tied by the law. I have to certify the election. I don't have the authority to call a special session to do this, and basically refused to go along with that. Trump has endorsed David Perdue, who lost his reelection to the Senate last year in an effort to oust Kemp. Perdue has sort of done a 180 and now says the election was stolen, that it was rigged, and this is very clearly retaliation against Governor Kemp for failing to accept President Trump's wish to convene a special session.
Wow. And so when it comes to the constituents there and individuals in Georgia, especially after they've seen kind of Kemp steal his position to begin with, and also these attacks on Raffensperger, are people in Georgia kind of more positioned to, I hate to say it, get right?
Well, I think that a lot of voters I talk to are still kind of just tuning into the primary, and it wasn't clear to me that they're going to go along with the effort to get rid of Secretary Raffensperger. I talked to lots of voters who said, I like Trump, I'm a fan of Trump, but I'm going to vote for Raffensperger. He did the right thing, he did his job, and that's the person that I want in office. So it's not entirely clear to me that Trump is going to be successful to get Jody Hice into office.
Yeah, and that would be very nice in the event that he wasn't successful at all. And I guess let's talk a little bit about down there in Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Green. So assuming she can stay on the ballot, how do things look for her?
Well, she represents a very conservative district in Georgia. I spent a little bit of time last week in that district, and she'll have a Democratic challenger. She'll have primary challengers, but I think it's going to be very hard to oust her from office. She's a nationally known figure, obviously extremely controversial, but she comes from a very, very conservative district, and I think it's very hard to imagine a world in which a Democratic opponent would beat her.
Oh, that's too bad. It's funny, you say conservative, and I don't equate that to stupid. So part of me just was hoping people would be a little bit wiser in their choices, given what MTG has brought to the table, and know that hopefully they can do better. But it does sound like maybe they realize that she does have some kind of stronghold. But it would be great if individuals were a little bit more intelligent in terms of the leadership that they choose. Maybe they need to suffer a little bit before they make wise decisions, but I'll just leave it there. And in terms of where we're going when it comes to these midterms coming up, I guess, what do you forecast in terms of how things will shake out?
Well, this is a midterm election that still looks very, very strong for Republicans. Republicans are picking up seats in the House through redistricting. In a midterm election, Republicans traditionally do very well when there's a Democrat in the White House. The president's party traditionally does not do well in the midterms. So this really seems like it is Republicans' election to lose. I think, the Supreme Court's decision, it potentially overturning Roe versus Wade, could complicate that, could energize an entire new wave of voters to come out. But I think right now it still really looks like Republicans are poised to do extremely well in the midterm elections.
And do you think with this draft Roe v. Wade opinion, essentially gutting the privacy rights that accompany abortion and rights to contraception and everything else that really kind of follows the progeny, do you think that that in any way is going to sway Republicans at all, whether it be Republican women, white women, particularly in Georgia?
I think it could. I mean, we know that the crucial areas of the country are sort of suburban areas where there was sort of a move away from President Trump. Democrats are obviously going to be extremely focused on those areas, and I would expect very strong messaging targeting women in these areas. Framing this as an issue about personal liberty, personal choice that cuts across partisan lines. So I think Democrats are certainly hoping that they'll be able to make some inroads there.
Yeah, because I could imagine it, and particularly in part because I guess I'm just tired of seeing individuals vote against their own interests, particularly white women, and it led us to the situation here. And so it makes me wonder: do you end up having to be in a full maroon gown with your hood on before you realize that it's a problem and maybe you should vote in your own interest? But I hope that day doesn't come. But it looks like it is right there on the forefront. So let's hope that the women down there in Georgia get it together, because I would very much appreciate that, and I think the rest of the United States would, at least those of us in Cali. But in terms of individuals across the nation who want to follow you and to find out more about what you're doing in terms of your reporting and also what you are covering, where can they find you on social media, Sam?
I'm on Twitter at SRL, just those three letters.
All right, you got in early, I'm guessing, with your Twitter name, so that is fantastic. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We very much appreciate it. That is Sam Levine, democracy correspondent and national reporter covering voting rights in the United States. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thanks so much.